Hi, Glenys.
Hey, Aaron. What do you want to talk about today?
How much I hate diets.
Yeah, diets suck.
So what do you do instead of a diet?
Intuitive eating. Health at every size.
So how many times have you had to explain intuitive eating and health at every size to someone?
Like 5,000 times. But that was just to my doctor.
Okay, so how many times have you explained it to someone and then they said, but diets are the only thing I know?
That's like every time. Can we pursue health without thinking about weight?
Yes, we can pursue health without thinking about weight.
That's pretty revolutionary, what you just said. But what if you just don't like yourself at the size that you're at?
I think we need to understand why, instead of just saying I need to change.
So, what's the deal with body positivity?
Oh man, that's a long answer. I'm Aaron Flores.
And I'm Glenys Oyston. And we are Dietitians Unplugged.
Welcome back for another episode of Dietitians Unplugged. Glenys, it's nice to be back in the virtual studio with you.
It is indeed. Back for another exciting episode.
Yeah.
Wherein we talk about a very interesting book that's about to come out.
Yeah, you put this book on my radar, and I'm really thankful that you set this one up. This is really quite an interesting book and an interesting episode, and I think people are really gonna enjoy it.
Yeah. So we're gonna talk to the author of the book called The Eating Instinct, which is available for pre-order now. So you're going to get it hot off the presses. The author is Virginia Smith, who I've known for a couple years now. And she's a reporter, and she's written this book about, it sort of starts off with the eating difficulties of her daughter, and then she parlays it into a whole book about how eating difficulties happen in adults, and basically, but really talking about diet culture, like with that as a main undercurrent, which I appreciated.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the connection might not be able to draw a good line for them, but she does a really good job in her book of explaining how this experience with her child really connected to seeing diet culture. You got to just trust us that there's a really awesome connection there.
Yeah. So I'll read Virginia's bio. So like I said, I connected with her a couple years ago as she was writing this book, actually. And, but also she kindly quoted me in a few articles over the last couple years. So I'm always appreciative about that. But her writing is really great and very health at every size focused now. So Virginia is the author of The Eating Instinct, Food Culture, Body Image, and Guilt in America. As a journalist, she has reported from kitchen tables and grocery stores, graduated from beauty school, and gone swimming in a mermaid's tail. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Elle, and many other publications. She's also a contributing editor with Parents Magazine and co-host of the Comfort Food Podcast, the Nations Institute Investigative Fund, and the Economic Hardship Reporting Project have supported several of her projects. She lives in New York's Hudson Valley with her husband, 2 daughters, and 3 cats. She's a cat person. That was my takeaway. No, just kidding. Oh
my God.
Yeah, we're so giddy at this point of the day. We're not laughing at this bio. We're laughing at our ridiculousness. So
our ridiculous comments, yeah.
Yeah, which happens both in front of the microphone and behind the microphone. Generally, we're just, I think we're just so tired at 10 in the morning.
Yeah. That's true.
So I'm excited to sort of talk to Virginia about this book because we've been reading it, and it is a really, really good book.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think it's well worth your time, and I think once you hear this interview, I think you're probably going to want to go out and pre-order the book for sure.
Yeah. So Should we launch in?
Yeah. So without further ado, here's our interview with Virginia Smith.
Hey, Virginia, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, we've gotten to know each other over the last couple of years, and you've graciously quoted me in a few articles, and I thank you for that. That's been really nice. And I'm so happy to know that there's, a writer out there that has a Hayes perspective and is sharing it with the world.
Well, I feel like I've learned so much every time we have a conversation. So it is totally my pleasure to do that. And yes, get this message out there.
Thank you.
I'm not bitter at all, by the way, that I haven't been interviewed yet.
I'll get you next time, I promise.
Ouch.
Oh my! So many times have I heard that. Just kidding. This is not my therapy session. Sorry.
I mean, it could be if you want it to be, but. So talking about your book that you've got coming out, The Eating Instinct, coming out in November, correct?
Yeah, November 13th.
And available for pre-order, do you know the exact date, or mid-October?
Right now. It is available for pre-order.
Right order.
Amazon, IndieBound, anywhere you get your books, it's there. Yep.
Awesome. So it's called The Eating Instinct. And Erin and I had the pleasure of reading an advance copy. And I must admit, I was on the edge of my seat with some parts of it. And specifically the part about your sort of traumatic experience with feeding your newborn daughter after she had medical issues. And just a note to people, do not read this when you're trying to relax at night, and because it will have you on the edge of your seat and you have to finish the chapter to know, everything that happened. But do you want to tell us, without too many spoilers for everybody, do you want to tell us a little bit about what happened with your daughter that sort of started this off?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will, spoiler alert, because it is a disturbing story, say right now that Violet is a happy, healthy 5-year-old, loving kindergarten and eating very well. So it goes to a good place. And I feel like I want to put that out there because it is a disturbing story. And, certainly if people are struggling with this stuff in their own life, I don't want to, set anyone off. But
right.
When Violet was born, she seemed like a totally healthy, typical newborn. Delivery was normal, all that stuff. Went home. The first month of her life, I was breastfeeding. We were not sleeping. It was, everything the blur that you expect newborn life to be. And then the day before she turned 1 month old, she almost died. And the reason she almost died is because she has a rare congenital heart condition that was not detected during my pregnancy or at birth and caused her heart to basically shut down over the course of the first month of her life. So when that happened, all we knew that morning was she had slept for a really long time. I think she slept like 6 hours that night, which anyone who's had a newborn knows that almost never happens. So we were like, gosh, she's sleeping a lot. And she wasn't latching as well, and she didn't seem that hungry. And I was like, well, that seems strange. Why isn't she hungry when she slept so much? Shouldn't she be hungry? And fortunately, we had her 1 month checkup at our pediatrician's office that day. So we got in there and said, she seems to be sleepy and not that hungry. And then they weighed her and realized she was actually below her birth weight. And the pediatrician looked at her and said, something's wrong with her heart. Her fingertips and her lips were sort of a dusky purplish color. And that's how they know that babies with anyone, that's how they know that her blood oxygen level, which your blood oxygen level should be 100%. Hers was plummeting. I think at that point in the pediatrician's office, it was around 70%, which, is dangerously low.
Very low.
And by the end of the day, it had dropped to 18%.
Wow.
Yeah. So thankfully, we were immediately in an ambulance on our way to a children's hospital where they saved her life with several emergency procedures, including putting her on a ventilator. The upshot of this incredibly terrifying day was that she stopped eating, which sort of feels like a weird side effect to come about from that. I mean, we were then on this journey of needing to have an open heart surgery very quickly and knowing that there would be this longer tail of managing her heart condition. But the eating thing happened right away and really came out of nowhere to us. And what we've later figured out happened was several things happened. One, she had, over that first month of her life, initially breastfeeding was going well. She was kind of getting spottier with it. And we think because she was having to work so hard while she was in heart failure that she sort of lost her ability and sort of understanding of eating as something she needed to do. She was trying to preserve her airway. And if you're trying to preserve your airway, swallowing things doesn't feel like it's, a logical thing to do. So she was sort of resisting breastfeeding, too weak to breastfeed. And then in the hospital that day, they had to intubate her while she was still conscious, which, we don't really know what a newborn's experience that is, but we can assume having a plastic tube shoved down your throat pretty aggressively, not a good experience for anybody. And so she developed what's known as an oral aversion, where as a baby, she wouldn't put anything in her mouth. She wouldn't put her own hand in her mouth. She wouldn't put toys in her mouth. She didn't gum on things. And anyone who's had a baby knows that is, putting things in their mouth is like their raison d'etre. Like that is how they function in the world. Mm-hmm. And so since she wouldn't put anything in her mouth, she couldn't eat. And so she became dependent on a feeding tube for the better part of 2 years while we tried to figure out how to help her heal from that trauma.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, like I love that in your book how you really do make this connection to eating and being like so primal that we don't even think about it, half the time, and to have it be at the forefront now of this medical journey for your daughter really highlights how much eating is a part of our lives, and when it's gone, how much it affects everything else.
Yeah, it was so weird because it made me realize, I mean, as a mom with a baby, like feeding is like all you have in the beginning. Like newborns don't do anything else. So if you can't feed your baby, it's like, how can you parent? I mean, it's fundamental to how you parent with a baby. And so that felt like this weird disconnect. Like we had to figure out how to bond with this child who wasn't doing the typical thing that babies do. And it felt so strange to have to understand, like, how can something that I knew and had been instinctive in her, as soon as she was born, within a few hours of being born, she had latched, she had fed, like this is what we're born. Babies are born knowing that when they're hungry, they know to eat, then they feel full and fall asleep. And like, that is how the first few weeks of life go. And so to realize that had not been working, when honestly, I didn't even realize that it wasn't. So that was something that was really difficult to process, that I thought I had been feeding my baby and keeping her alive. And instead she was dangerously ill and losing weight rapidly. That was very traumatic. And then to think, well, how do we get her back to this instinctive place with food? How do we help her realize that, of course, this is a good, safe thing to do? Because her reasons for not eating were self-preservation. Like they were another kind of instinct coming in. So they were logical, but not serving her once she got over the initial, when she was really too critically ill to eat. Once she was stable again, obviously it wasn't continuing to serve her to stop eating.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's so interesting because you mentioned like the eating instinct that we all have, right? Hopefully that we are all born with, and then sort of that happened to Violet, and it was it just threw her eating instinct right off. And then I'm just wondering how then you sort of started to think about what happens to the eating instinct for other people. Your book is a lot about diet culture, which I totally appreciate. So I'm just wondering how you started sort of thinking about that as a subject.
Right, because it's a weird left turn, right? I was like, here I have this critically ill infant on a feeding tube, and now I'm going to write about diet culture. But they really are connected. And I think the reason I connected those dots, maybe not everybody would have gone to this place, but, I'd spent years before Violet was born, before I became a mom, a lot of what I wrote about was how women relate to their bodies. And a lot of times I was writing it from the dark side. I wrote for a lot of women's magazines, wrote a lot of articles about blood sugar I'm not super proud of. And during, but when you're a young, broke freelance writer, you're taking every assignment. And I was kind of going through my own process of thinking, why are we so fixated on making our bodies smaller? Why are we, as women's magazines, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, were very, very, very prescriptive. And we were always writing these plans. People were always looking for these rules to tell them how to eat, like what size should every portion be, and, this and that, and all these specific nitty-gritty things about how to manage food in their lives. And I was increasingly disgruntled with this, increasingly feeling like this was not serving women. But it wasn't until I saw Violet's eating instincts covered up in such a profound and brutal and quick way that I realized, okay, now I have to make this baby trust food again, when most adults I know don't trust food, when most adults are not able to say, how does my body need to eat? When do I feel hungry? When do I feel full? And the reason for that is because of diet culture overriding our instincts over and over and over. So I realized in some ways the feeding tube is like a metaphor, and we're all kind of on a feeding tube because we're all out in the world being told every day that we don't know how to eat and that we need to listen to somebody else on how to do it. So we're all losing those instincts all the time.
I think it's such wow. That's, to me, that's a very profound metaphor. And again, you summarized it right there, right? Is we've, for many people, we've actually unlearned
definitely. It's like a brutal unlearning
It's a brutal
process.
unlearning of our natural instinct, and how powerful of a force it must be for that to happen, and it for me, it puts diet culture in perspective as such a strong force, and it's not something to be sort of taken lightly in how it affects our daily life.
No, I totally agree. And I think, the one thing I'll say about going through the situation with Violet that did give me a lot of hope is I did come away feeling like, because ultimately we did get her there, we did help her learn to trust food again. And if a baby can do that after undergoing such an intensely traumatic experience, it was really life or death there. I do feel like we can do this. We can fight diet. It's just diet culture. It doesn't need to have this much power, but it's not that simple. I'm not trying to say that's an easy thing to just be like, cool, I can just turn that off. I mean, it's really complicated, but I do think we can be stronger than it.
Yeah.
It did give me a lot of hope.
Absolutely. So you're talking about, you used to sort of write from the dark side. So it sounds like you yourself have had sort of a personal transition in the way you think about food and eating, and I'm just wondering, because you I think very much embrace a health at every size philosophy now.
Yes,
and I wonder
definitely.
just how that transition happened for you.
It's funny. I was thinking back when you sent that question along, I was like, when did that happen? And I think it was a couple of things. I think even when I was first at women's magazines and writing some of these articles, it was never like, I was always questioning it. I was always like, that wasn't what I wanted to do. I kept trying to like reframe the stories, or I'd pitch different angles and be like, but let's look at let's look at this. What if we didn't show the before and after photos? Like, why do we have to do that? Like I was always questioning it and feeling like it, there had to be another way. And then I think I read Linda Bacon's book in probably, whenever it came out, shortly after it came out. And that was hugely, hugely eye-opening. But I don't feel like I truly integrated it all for myself until after Violet was born, and after, honestly, through the process of writing this book in some ways, because I think intellectually, it was all making sense to me before Violet. And it was something I was becoming increasingly, I was like, this is a story I want to tell. This is really important. This message needs to be out there. Women need to hear this. But I was still personally struggling with some, my own body image and weight and going back and forth on things. So I hadn't really connected all the dots sort of and integrated it into myself, I would say, even though I was like, yes, I completely am on board intellectually, which I think is common. It can kind of resonate with you, but it takes a while for you to really shed your own demons. And then I think once we were in the trenches with Violet and really having, a big way that we helped her eventually become comfortable with food was we had to model family meals. We had to eat breakfast with her, lunch, eat food with her every day. And, that sounds obvious, but, when you have a kid who's not eating at all and you're just like putting them in the high chair and like they're watching you eat, like it's a strange experience, but you're trying to show like eating is fun, eating is cool. We all love it. It's so good to do. And in order to do that, I had to let go of, my inner critic on this stuff. Like I had to silence those voices and stop apologizing for feeling hungry, because I wanted my daughter to know what hunger was and that it's really important to listen to. I had to stop shaming myself for different food choices. And I then started hearing it everywhere too. I remember when she was about 15 months old, still very feeding tube dependent, but we were at the point where she would sit in her high chair and kind of push around little bits of food and sometimes take bites, sometimes not. It was like early days. And a caregiver who was a wonderful person and loved Violet dearly, she was giving her pieces of cheese and she said, oh, Violet, you're so lucky you can eat cheese. I can't eat cheese. It makes me fat. And I just thought, oh, why are you saying this to a baby? Like, why are you saying this out loud at all?
Right.
But to a baby.
Here, we're trying to fix your current feeding difficulties, but here's some for the future. Yeah, just put this one in your back pocket and worry about this.
You'll need it when you're about 13. Yeah, it'll be really useful. That was a real... And you know what, though? I tell that story. And to be honest, though, there's another story, which is like a few weeks later, I did it unconsciously. We were talking to Violet's dietitian, and my husband handed her a piece of bacon. And I said something like, oh, you can't feed her bacon in front of our dietitian. What will she think? You know, like I made and thank God we had a wonderful dietitian who just looked right at me and then looked at Violet and said, Violet, bacon is one of life's most perfect foods. And I was like, oh, right. Yes. I got to put this away. I got to stop this, you know? So that really is when I think I was able to break through on a lot of stuff.
That dietitian
personally.
is my hero.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, she was awesome.
But also, I mean, you mentioned how the book helped you so much. I mean, I think what impressed me so much as I went through this book is how many health at every size practitioners, I don't know how I want to word it, like providers, experts, you really consulted for this book. And there are many names in here that, you know, for people who are familiar with health at every size will say, oh, I know who that person is. Oh, I know who that, I mean, like you really went deep and found some people who could really speak to this issue in many different ways, right? Each chapter is a little bit different about what you're talking about, but you found someone who could relate health at every size to that topic throughout the entire book. So how did you sort of connect with all these people as you were doing this work?
Yeah, it was kind of like one conversation would lead to another conversation. I mean, always when I talk to somebody, who else should I talk to about this? And who else is working on this? And it does seem like, I mean, I consider myself, I'm a reporter. I'm on the outsides of these worlds. I'm not a therapist or a dietitian or, sort of in the world the way you guys are. But it does seem from where I'm sitting to be a smallish community where people are like very supportive of one another. I think that is accurate. And so it was great that people were very generous with like, oh, well, so-and-so is doing something really interesting on this too. Or, so a lot of it was just kind of following those breadcrumbs that people gave me. And that's what you do as a journalist always. You're looking for, who else is working on this, trying to get your arms around the topic. I mean, what I love about my job is that I basically dive deep into these issues and just soak up as much as I can from everybody. So yeah, a lot of it is just having more and more conversations.
And did you have a particular chapter that you really enjoyed writing or like researching?
Oh gosh, they were all so good. That's a really tough question.
Sophie's choice. Pick a favorite,
Yeah. The chapter on bypass surgery was really hard, but really when I did feel like I was trying to get my arms around it, that was really satisfying. I think that, and I loved the women who are the main characters in that, Gina and Rachel, were just like amazing women, really generous with their time and sort of inviting me in on those journeys with them. They're two women who I follow through their experiences of having weight loss surgery and what it's like on the other side and how they, how you really have to learn to eat again, full stop. I mean, it's in many ways not unlike being on a feeding tube. And only permanent because your stomach's been completely reshaped. And I think it was so interesting because that's a topic where health at every size is struggling a little bit because on the one hand, we want to say, we want to fight back against this whole idea of the surgery and that we should, and I think, Deb Burgard says in that chapter, what's wrong with feeling hungry? Like, why are we trying to erase people from feeling hungry, which is what the surgeons all promised with that surgery. And she's completely right. And I totally hear that. And at the same time, people are getting the surgery. So can we support them through it in a way that, like, how can we help them through that in a way that could keep some of their eating instincts intact and keep their sense of self intact? And I think there's a lot that the Hayes perspective can offer those people. But because there's a lot of debate over whether the surgery should be happening, period, that's not always happening, I think. So that was interesting to explore all the tensions there.
Definitely a heated topic in the community, for sure.
Yeah. And understandably so. I mean, I think both sides are making excellent arguments. It's, I didn't come away thinking, oh, good, weight loss surgery, that's the answer by any means. And anyone who reads the book will see that is not the conclusion I drew.
Right. I mean, it's probably one of the more nuanced conversations that come up, and they're really, I think you're right. There is no one side. I mean, I think it's like it's very difficult on all aspects.
Yeah, it's hard because, for someone who, like Gina, for example, the main character in that chapter, the reason she had very much adopted a health at every size perspective for herself, but the reason she had ended up having the surgery was because she couldn't get treated for infertility. The fertility clinics kept turning her away and saying she was too obese for fertility treatment, which turns out to be an increasingly common issue. And it's appalling that that's happening and that women are being turned away from these fertility clinics. But, she really wanted to have a child. She didn't feel like she had a lot of choices, and this was a way through that. And I can't, I hate that she was in that situation, but I certainly support her choices there.
Ooh, tough one. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that.
So, Virginia, what I wanted to say about this chapter about bariatric surgery, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are like, oh, I don't want to read about bariatric surgery, and you might not, so you can always skip this chapter. But I was really appreciated that you were one of the few writers that came at this, one, with a health at every size perspective, fully represented. Like you talked to, Deb Burgard, you even talked to Linda Bacon a little bit, you just talked to a lot of people about this, and that, it's like you said, you didn't come away going like, this is the answer. Like that's the takeaway I get from so many articles about bariatric surgery, where they're like, here's all the horrific problems with it, but good luck, do it anyway, kind of thing. So I thought that you gave like a really balanced, like it's really up to the person to decide if this is a good thing or not. And for me, as I'm reading it, I'm like, I feel like everything you've written about supports how I feel about bariatric surgery, which is that I'm not a fan of it, but people are having it. So how are we going to deal with them in the health at every size community? Not deal with them. How are we going to,
support them?
Support them. Thank you. That is the correct word I'm trying to use. How are we going to support people that have gone through this? So I really appreciated that you brought that perspective in, that it wasn't like the depressing conclusion that we always seem to come to at the end of articles where they're like, and do it anyway, because you're a problem.
Because you're huge, so you have to fix that. Yeah, which is right. I mean, that's never the message that readers will get from me. I think what's problematic about it is, if you really support body autonomy, you have to support that people can make this choice. Even if you don't think they need it, even if you would make a different choice for yourself, like we have to support that they have the right to make this choice if, like in Gina's case, it felt really necessary in order to pursue fertility treatment. If they have some other, they can have any reason. They could just want to do it. It's their body. And so if we're really, as the health at every size movement, if we're really clear on body autonomy as a huge goal, we have to be supportive of this, even if they're doing something that feels not quite in line with the other goals of the movement. So it's tricky, and it definitely is. But I do feel strongly that we need to find a way to, and I think some of the people I interviewed, Mercy Evans is a dietitian in Boston who's fantastic, and she works with a lot of people post-weight loss surgery from a HAES perspective. And it was really interesting hearing how she's able to help them, as they're relearning to eat, as they're learning to live with these new limitations of their body, they can still come at it from a positive, body positive place. So that's encouraging.
I learned some new things from that chapter. So I do hope people will sort of read it, because it's just an interesting part of your book too. And then the other chapter I really enjoyed was, now I forgot it. So I was just thinking about Eating While Black. Sorry, I knew it was in there. Eating While Black, and then you talked to 4 Black families and about their struggles with eating in the light of our culture's unrealistic ideals of health. And you wrote, the intersection between race and diet culture is particularly toxic. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you discovered while you were researching that chapter?
Yeah, first let me back up and kind of give a little context for how that chapter came into the book, because I am really clear that I am a white lady and, this is not my lived experience. So it was really important to me. I wanted the book to be diverse and representative, but I also would never want to co-opt someone else's experience. So I put a lot of thought into how can I, address some of these parts of the conversation, knowing kind of, what I bring to that. The reason I wanted to tell the stories of Tiana and Sharita and the other women in that chapter, I met them while I was reporting a piece on the welfare system for Harper's magazine several years ago. And I had followed them all first, off and on. So the kind of journalism I do where I'm telling individuals like really deeply personal stories, you often sort of spend intense periods, like you'll hang out with someone for a couple of days and then you're texting for a while or follow-up phone calls. And so, I'm in and out of their lives over a period of a couple of years in the case of those women. I've seen their kids get older. I've seen them kind of cycle through different aspects of being in the system, being off benefits, being, working, not working, all the stuff that they're struggling with, living in poverty in Northern Philadelphia, which is where they all are from. And what really struck me when I was initially reporting the first article and thinking more about the welfare system from a political perspective, was that, you kind of assume there's a lot of assumptions people make about poor Black women and how they eat. And most of them are false. I mean, these women knew just as much about, quote, healthy eating or whole foods or, detoxing or going vegan. They had all the same information that I had, that my sort of white yuppie friends have, that this is not, we have this idea that modern diet culture and the focus on wellness and whole foods and clean eatings is very white, sort of the Gwyneth Paltrow mode of eating, and thus only the kind of rich white yoga moms that you find in Brooklyn or Los Angeles care about this stuff. And it's kind of the same as the misconception that only white teenage girls get anorexia, which we also know is completely false, that there are, disturbing rates of eating disorders in every racial community and every socioeconomic background. So, these women are getting all the same messages of diet culture. And if anything, it's even more toxic because they're being told to aspire to this standard of beauty and health that feels even more unattainable for them. I mean, they never see themselves represented in magazines or on Instagram, all the places where you see the models that, make up our, quote, beauty standards. And they don't have the budget to shop at Whole Foods, even though they feel the same guilt other moms feel when they're buying more processed foods for their kids. So they're kind of getting all the same stuff without, any of the ways out that the rest of us are choosing to cope with it. And then there's this really problematic tradition, and this was what I learned while I was researching the chapter. Shakira Simley, who's a Black food activist, really educated me on this. But there's this very problematic tradition in the alternative food movement of being kind of white crusaders, where they go into low-income neighborhoods and they think like, we're going to teach these families about community gardens and about kale and about healthy eating, and we're going to keep them away from the bodegas and the fast food. And it's incredibly paternalistic. It's often done with very little input from the communities about what are they really struggling with. Is getting more kale in their diet what they really need, or is it, paying their heating bill? Like, this is, the priorities are totally skewed. And there's a lot of co-opting Black food culture. Kale, for example, is now this sort of hipster vegetable du jour, but it started as a staple of Black Southern cooking. So all of that I felt like was a really important story to tell in this larger context of looking at how food culture is getting in the way of our eating instincts.
I love what you're saying about, the sort of white savior idea of going in, like, they just don't know about vegetables. And like, I'm pretty sure they know about vegetables. Hey, how about looking at why people don't have time to cook, or why people can't get, to places where they can buy vegetables easily at a decent price, or don't have time, or don't have the money. Like, it's so far beyond a knowledge deficit. It's probably not at all a knowledge deficit.
It's nothing to do with that. They're getting all the same stuff, all the same information the rest of us are getting. It's that, but they're, it's the Michael Pollan school of like, eat plants and cook everything from scratch. I mean, that is a garbage piece of advice to give to someone who's a single mom working 3 jobs and with a long commute and trying to keep her life together. Like, when is she cooking from scratch? When is, of course she's going to Popeyes for dinner. It's logical. and we should support her right to make that choice, not undermine it by giving her all this extra guilt.
So what I love about this chapter, and I'm like, when I read it, I was so thankful that you included this in there, and you did a really good job of in this chapter of writing about it, is, I think this is where Health at Every Size really shines on some level, is looking at not just this notion that, right, that health is not determined by the size of our body, but more importantly, like, what are the societal factors that make health like a moral imperative, and that if you don't, for some reason, you're failing as a human in our society. And I think shining the light, especially like on this sort of this white savior mentality that like, oh, well, we know what to do, let's go in and fix it. I think highlights this sort of how Health at Every Size can really come in and talk about this as a social justice movement and looking at the disparities of health in our country. And I think you just really, I think you did a great job of bringing this to light in your book. So I'm really thankful that you included this part, because I think 9 times out of 10, this chapter is not in the book.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
It's just it's not even a consideration. When you wrote it, did you get any pushback that like, why are you writing about this in your book?
My editor and my agent were hugely supportive of it being in there. I think they, from the beginning, because they knew I'd done this other poverty reporting, were really interested to see how, did I think it connected? Was it a part of it? So not from them, not from the publisher, which was wonderful. They've been hugely supportive. When I was having conversations with friends or with other writers, I think there was this anxiety, and this is valid, that, this is a chapter that really should be written by a Black writer. This is a story that should be told by someone who's living in the community. And so I think that's something I'm always very aware of, because it's, but at the same time, all of these stories are other people's stories. I mean, my story is just in the first and last chapter, and the whole rest of the book is other people's stories. That's what I do as a journalist, is get people to tell me their stories so I can write about them. So, you could kind of question the ethics of my entire job, I guess, if you want to pursue that. But I think that, you have to be aware when you're telling somebody's story and they have a very different background from you, that you're really representing them and not putting your own lens on it. And that's just a challenge as a writer. The other thing that I was very aware of was I didn't want to perpetuate stereotypes. And there's already enough out there that, the only people on food stamps are Black and low income, which is not true. There are tons and tons of white people on food stamps, that the only people on welfare are Black. So I was anxious about that piece of it, because I think it's really important that we recognize the diversity of people who are relying on our social safety nets. And that's why those systems are so important. But at the same time, I felt like this particular story about poor Black women really was important to tell in the context of the larger argument of the book. So that was another tension I had to sort through to make sure that, I wasn't perpetuating a stereotype. Much like in the weight loss surgery chapter, I didn't want to perpetuate the stereotype that all obese people are binge eaters, even though the 2 women that I profiled in that chapter struggled with binge eating at times, that's not what all, we have these boiled down ideas about what causes someone to be poor, what causes someone to be overweight. And, the whole point was to try to get away from that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome information. And it must be really hard to remain objective. So good training for you as a journalist.
Yeah, definitely.
So how has your idea of healthy eating evolved through this process? I mean, you've written this book. Like, how would you say where are you now compared to where you started?
Well, one thing I really learned through the process with Violet, and then again, something that kind of was repeating itself in all these interviews with people, is how important comfort is in eating and pleasure with eating. And I think so often we think nutrition is like the more important goal of every meal. Like, it should trump everything, right? If the meal is not nutritious, you failed. And I now know that there was no way Violet was ever going to eat again if she didn't find it comforting. That's why she stopped. It felt dangerous and unsafe. So we fundamentally, as humans, don't eat when we don't feel safe. And so once I understood that, I thought, nutrition is great. Nutrition is really useful. And, I'm glad there's dietitians talking about nutrition, guys, but it's not the number one priority in every meal you're going to eat in your life. And I think if we could step back from that, especially with parents who are worrying about how their kids eat, which is a huge focus of the book, and what I write about now, if we could step back from that and remember how important comfort is to eating, I think it would go such a long way towards breaking down a lot of this stuff. And it's definitely something that I've, given myself more permission to embrace the comfort aspect of eating and, get away from, we think comfort food, we think, God, emotional eating, we think, oh my God, you're over it. We go to this negative place with it, but that's not what it is, really. That it doesn't have to be that.
Oh, I love that more than you probably know, because that comes up so often right now in so many of my conversations is pleasure in eating and struggling to find pleasure in eating. And I think you put it really well. And I think that resonates really well with hearing what so many of my clients are struggling with right now.
Yeah, we've really gotten this idea that we need to feel guilty every time we enjoy eating. That's why people apologize so much. Every office party is such torture because everybody's so apologizing for the cake all the time.
Just eat it.
Oh, it's the worst. Or don't eat it and don't apologize for that.
Exactly. Just enjoy it or don't enjoy it, but please stop moralizing about it.
Right. And we've gotten, in every holiday, people are like, oh, I can't believe I ate all this food on Thanksgiving. Of course you did. It's Thanksgiving.
Right.
It's what we're here to do.
Yes.
That's, so I just think we've really gone so far in that away from feeling okay about enjoying food and bringing that back. That's, so in the final chapter, I talk about when Violet became ill again after her third open heart surgery. And I really saw, because she was a little older then, she was almost 3. And so, it wasn't the sort of feeding a baby with formula and all that. It was we're trying to actually get her to eat food now. And I really saw that it was, it wasn't until she felt comfortable again in her body and the act of eating felt comfortable that she could do it. And so, you have to have that piece. It's so essential.
Well, I could talk about every part of this book all day, but we'll let people read it. So I just want to be and then this part where just let people read the book.
Like you mentioned, Violet is how old now?
She is 5 years old now.
And what are some of her favorite foods?
Mac and cheese. It will shock you to hear a 5-year-old loves mac and cheese. She loves, she eats a lot of different stuff. She loves all berries. We cannot, between her and my younger daughter, the amount I spend on berries in a week is ridiculous. We go through several pints of blueberries, strawberries, raspberries. And yeah, any kind of pasta. This is not in the book, but feeding my second daughter, who is a typical baby and had none of these issues, has been really interesting just because, she's only 11 months old and at this point will eat literally anything I give her. So it's been a really fun process because it really shows you how much fun eating can be when she's completely devoid of any trauma and of any diet culture messages at this point and just revels in it. So that makes meals with them a lot of fun right now.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. And I appreciate that you mentioned comfort and pleasure from eating because you have a podcast called Comfort Food. Do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah. So Comfort Food is a podcast I co-host with my friend Amy Palangian, who is a blogger at Yummy Toddler Foods. So she writes all about feeding babies and up to kind of age 5 kids. And we decided to do this podcast. So Amy creates amazing recipes. She's got lots of great tricks for packing school lunches and kind of navigating all the mechanics of feeding children, which is a lot of work and can often get very stressful for parents. And she has tons of great solutions on that. And then I come at it more as someone who reports on all of these diet culture phenomenons and these different messages I'm seeing in the culture and how we're absorbing them. And so it's the podcast about the joys and meltdowns of feeding our families and feeding ourselves. And we talk about all things feeding kids and particularly moms feeding themselves and feeling good about eating so that we can model a healthy relationship with food for our kids.
Awesome.
And you can get it anywhere you get your podcasts or comfortfoodpodcast.com.
Awesome. We need more good food podcasts.
Yeah. And less diet ones.
Not fear food podcasts.
Yeah, there are plenty of those. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us about your book. Available for pre-order now anywhere you buy your books. It's called The Eating Instinct by Virginia Soule Smith. And where can people find you if they want to find out more about what you've written?
I am online at virginiasoulesmith.com. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at v_soulsmith or Virginia Soule Smith on Facebook.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and we will be looking out for you and everything that you're reading in the future.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. This was so much fun.
This has been another episode of Dietitians Unplugged. For more about Aaron, go to his website at www.bvmrd.com. And for more about Glenys, go to her website, www.daretonotdiet.com.
This episode was produced by Aaron and Glenys. Post-production was done by Toby Lyles at 24 Sound. And the music was composed and performed by Dylan Wright.